Alrighty, it is on to the Ice card set review. So we're starting off with everybody's least favorite Duchess in Annabella. 2 cost backup, Cat 16. Job Duchess, when a character you control is priming, choose a character, dull it, and freeze it. So I think this card reads okay. I think a lot of people kind of are overestimating this. I think a little bit. My big issue with Annabella is the direct comparison with Minwu, actually. Also, like the Susne, the one that like gets the counter. Yes, when Annabella, in theory, you could prime Clive into Ifrit and get a dull freeze off. But I really don't see most decks priming more than once, maybe twice in a game. Even with a 2 element, if you're in like Fire Ice and you have Jills and Clives, you know, are both of those going to be priming every single game multiple times? If you freeze 2 things off of this, it kind of pays for itself, but it's still kind of slow in that regard when you could play like the Minwu and really disrupt the opponent. So I don't know. I don't really love the card just because maybe it's just the comparison with like Dion and Barnabas as these like cards that kind of promise the moon for like this character you control as priming text. But I really am not very high on Annabella. I think that she's very slow for what she's doing. Unless this like priming deck with every single thing ever becomes a deck, but the problem with that becomes name diversity. Every character that you run, the icon plus dominant thing is pretty much 6 slots. 5 or 6 slots every single time. You fill a deck up really quickly when you do that. So you just like don't have the forwards to actually end the game. So I don't know. I think she's fine. I would expect her to end up in a couple of topping lists if this like ice priming or fire ice priming deck is a thing. But I'm not really excited by this card in the way that I think a lot of other people have been. Undead Princess. So this is a card that first time I read it didn't give it much of a thought. So 3 cost ice undead waff with 7,000 power. When she enters the field, gain a crystal. Opponent discards a card. Really, the big thing that she started standing out with me is actually limited. We'll get to Refia LB later on, but this is a really nasty thing to be reviving with Refia. You kind of get the ability to like develop 2 forwards and gain a crystal and make your opponent discard a card. Um, Obviously, there's like Gigawall implications as well. I'm not huge on her in Gigawall. I know there's like some Crystal Gigawall builds around with like Cyan and Sarah Mobius and maybe now the new Bart's. I know it's gotten a bit of hype for Crystal stuff, but I don't love that as a concept. Just given that like you have to line things up really really neatly, and I feel like in a lot of situations, Undead Princess is just worse than the old Terra. It really is just that Refia LB that's kind of giving me pause because this is like being able to play this from the break zone for on a basically a four cost body gives me a bit of pause that this card might be a little better than I'm giving it credit for. Wall, 5 cost Job Warrior of Light. It's the first ever Ice Warrior of Light. Pictologica Mobius, 9k power. If your opponent discarded a card, he costs 2 less. When he attacks, discard 2, choose a forward, break it. So I don't think this card is like stone unplayable, but I don't think it's very good. If it was like reduced by 3, I could maybe squint. I think that like the King from a couple sets ago is kind of underplayed. I know he hasn't really seen like any experimentation. People just aren't big on playing cheap bodies that like could maybe do things later on. This just kind of has not been a card archetype that's done well, and it's like worse than King. So obviously, I don't really expect it to see much play. But I do think that King is probably a better card than people have given it credit for. And if that King is a better card than people give it credit for, I think Wall probably is a better card than people give it credit for. So transitive property there, but yeah. Musicians. This is the Ice backup of the cycle. Standard unit category FFTS. Tap, discard a card, choose a dull forward, deal it 5k. If it's lightning, deal it 7k instead. I think this card's mostly limited fodder. I do think that like this is one of the better ones of the cycle. I know that like hitting a dull forward is annoying, but the damage is like pretty relevant. Like 5k kills things that are small, 7k kills slightly bigger things. Um, it's not like the worst standard unit backup of all time, but there's so many good standard unit backups. I don't expect this to see much play outside of limited. Kadage, 3 CP EX, job Remnant, pick the Logica in 7 with 9k power. End of each of your turns, remove him from the game. At the end of your opponent's turn, play him onto the field, and on damage 3, he has a burst. When Kadage enters the field, choose a forward and dull it. So this is like a baby version of the Dark Kadage. Dark Kadage is still a card that probably should see some small amount of consideration. I think it's pretty much finally phased out of play entirely. I can't think of the last time I've actually like seen one or considered sleeving one up. But the card itself is still like a reasonable power level. That said, this Kadage doesn't have the mode on that Kadage that was the most obnoxious, which was the break zone removal one. You kind of had this really annoying thing that got to like poke in for damage and keep your opponent's break zone completely empty while you're setting up and kind of shell gaming a bit. I think the card is neat. I don't really expect it to see too much play unless there's like this ice aggro deck that really gets down like a Lufenian early and uses Kadage as like this difficult to hit threat that does things. The only forward that cares about an ice forward entering play every turn would be Al Cid. Gets a freeze when an ice forward enters. Maybe there's something there. But Al Cid is such a target on his back that I have to imagine that Al Cid is going to die a lot when you try for that. So mostly I think he's just a really strong card for limited. Kuja. This is a really interesting card actually. So Ice, 5 cost, Job Genome from Cat 9. When Kuja enters the field, you may remove an ice backup you control from the game. When you do, opponent discards 2 cards. And then when your opponent's chosen by a summon ability, if they don't discard a card, cancel its effect. So they just randomly gave us a cheaper Sepharoth with both an upside and downside. First things first, if you know where this art came from, please let me know, because I don't know where the Itohana art from this set came from. But the fact this didn't come in full art means this card is not new art for the card game, meaning this illustration must exist somewhere else. I just can't find it, or the Ico art, and I'm curious. So if you know where this art comes from, let me know, because I'm curious. But as far as Kuja himself goes, I think he's kind of... I've got 2 directions on him. You could consider him in like a mono ice mid-range. The big issue with that is those mono ice mid-range decks really want to keep their backups once they're in play for Kurosame and Kate Sith, and Kuja fights against that. So even though I think that 5 cost for a discard 2 is a really strong effect, I don't know how much I love it there. The places I do like it is in like a mono ice aggro shell. You can use this with your Lufenian to force a discard and then free up the backup for another Lufenian, which seems really strong. And in those decks, he'd be this big, sticky forward that also rips cards from their hand and kind of continues problems. Lastly, I think you could see a bit of play in Ice Lightning. Kuja's not really a contested name in that deck. That deck can kind of end up in a situation where it's almost got more backups than it has pressure, and Kuja could kind of relieve some, like, add pressure while not really caring about the backups nearly as much. The downside of that is I think that you'd rather remove a lightning backup than an ice backup most of the time, because a lot of times like your ice backups are ones you want to keep on field, and the lightning ones are the ones you'd like to replay. So definitely a card with a lot of potential. I think this card is actually like sneaky really strong, and I am not looking forward to having him dropped against me. Kajata. So this is part of our new Summon of Cycles. 3 cost, ice. You can alternate casting cost of dulling 2 ice forwards. And you choose a dull forward and break it. So we've seen this text on a couple of summons. This is the first really reasonable time we've seen this printed on, like the first time we've seen this printed at 3 costs on a summon with, and it has the alternate casting condition, which I think is really, really solid. This is kind of a hot take of mine. I actually think ice has a lot of like... Ice is getting into the critical mass on summons, where there's actually enough good summons for me to kind of consider like ice summon-based decks, especially when you factor in cards like Len and Terra. I do think that this card's main competition is going to be the Legend Sepharoth as like another 3 CP summon that breaks a dull forward. That one has the upside of also being a forward when you want it to be. Being an action ability makes it hard to interact with. This one has the upside of potentially being free. And I think especially in ice decks where card advantage can be so difficult to come by, that 3 CP discount on Kajata by dulling forwards you're not going to attack with anyway could really come up and really matter. So I really am high on Kajata. I think this card has a lot of potential. And I really think Ice is like kind of in a state now where it's got some sneaky good summons. Crychet. So this is Ice's monster in the cycle. 2 cost, Cat 7, Job Crychet. During your turn, it's a forward with 7,000 power and first strike. And when it deals damage to the opponent, you sacrifice it. When you do, your opponent discards 2 cards. This is like the cheapest discard 2 effect in the entire game. And the way that it interacts with stuff like EX bursts and a lot of other situations where, like, if it gets you hit an EX burst, it draws them a card. If they only had one in hand, they still rip both cards out of their hand. I think the fact that it's a 2 CP monster that can make them discard 2 that you control the timing of is really good. I think that Buckaboo ended up being probably like not as good because of the tempo loss when your opponent could kind of your opponent played around Buckaboo how they wanted to, but like the ability for Crychet to be this like looming threat of I have this 7k forward that is going to deal damage and eventually rip 2 from your hand is really strong actually. I think this card's really good. I don't know how much play it's going to see just because again Ice is as an element not one that I think is as experimented with, but I do think the card is like a very strong boost to Ice. I think that Ice actually is especially after this set, going to be in a really good spot. And it might take people a bit of time to catch on, but I think Ice is a very strong mono element as of last set, and I think this set as well. Shiva. So this is our second Shiva 16. It's an icon, and when Shiva 16 enters the field, you freeze all the forwards. When Jill, if she's primed into you by a Jill, instead of that, you freeze all the characters your opponent controls, and she has a special where S1 and tap, opponent discards 2 cards only during your main phase. So I think this card is bonkers. One thing to note, because people have kind of gotten this ruling wrong a lot, that second line, that when Jill primes into Shiva, if you're priming into Shiva, Shiva is not entering the field, so you don't get to both freeze the forwards and freeze the characters in case they like Amaterasu you. You don't get any freezes. Kind of a weird ruling thing that I think people have missed with this card quite a bit from what I've seen. But I think this card, one of the most powerful cards in Ice that I wanted to play in the Mono Ice Chaos Arc deck was Anima. And Anima is 5 cost. If both players do not have cards in hand, dull freeze all the characters your opponent controls. The big thing about Anima is both players had to be on no cards in hand, so you had to be able to set it up, which meant that there were awkward hands where you couldn't line it up very easily, or you'd get stuck with a dark card in your hand, you couldn't do it. Shiva is just Anima with none of the work. And especially in those control mid-range mono ice decks, they really wanted a finisher like this and didn't have access to one. There is very easily a world where you go Kate Sith, freeze your backups. Kurosame, freeze your backups. Jill, pay 1, kill a thing, prime into Shiva, freeze everything. And your opponent can have 5 backups for 3 turns and never have untapped with them. And I think that is extremely powerful. And the nice thing is that the other Shiva I think was a really strong card as well. So you have this like neat option select between this defensive or proactive option in a way that like the Ifrit really isn't. I think that this card is completely busted, and I'm really excited to play more with it. Sid Waff, 2CP EX Mech from Waff. Really simple text. When your opponent uses an EX burst, your opponent randomly discards a card. This guy's great. One of the big issues with Ice is what the counterplay to discard and Ice a lot of the time was you would junk your hand. You would just discard your entire hand and say, I will simply burst out. You're going to do your thing, and I'm going to then hit a Leviathan or a Cullen, and I'm going to keep 1 card. I'm going to untap with 3. But Sid Waff says, no, that's not a thing that you're allowed to do anymore. It ends up puts you in a situation now in Ice where if you get this guy down early against heavy EX burst decks or decks with a decent number of bursts, And you can put them in a lose-lose situation where they have to use the burst, but it puts them down even further on hand size. This guy only has to proc a couple of times to be really good. And the fact that it's random discard on top of everything else means that now if they hit like a Tyro, for instance, they're not guaranteed to get the card that gets them out of the situation. You're in ice, you should keep them to a low hand size to begin with once you start, pushing damage. Now that they're on a low hand size, Sid Waff is more likely to hit the card that you need to hit out of their hand. I think this card is completely bonkers. I kind of want to play an ice water deck that plays this and Lena and hit the mythical burst and have my opponent begrudgingly give me a draw and force themselves to discard to use a burst because they're going to have to or they're going to die. I think that would be so funny. But I think this guy is like a 2 to 3 F staple in like every single ice deck and a very strong reason to be considering the element moving forward. Sid Reigns. This is a really weird one. This was a very early hero spoiler we got. 2 cost, Job Psychom with 5k power. During this turn, if your opponent has discarded a card due to your summons or abilities, the cost required to cast them is reduced by 2. And when a forward enters their field from anywhere other than their hand, you may put them into the break zone to break the forward. So, I do think this guy has a home. Especially in like those mono ice aggro decks, there's kind of just a shortage of good, cheap ice forwards that kind of do things. And Sid Reigns is a card that can come down for free in those decks when they're not playing a lot of backups, can represent some removal and some kind of defensive play. That second effect, I don't think is like you're going to use it, but it's not. I don't think it's like Mog 6 broken or anything. It's not like sack this thing and all of a sudden your opponent can't play forwards from other than their hand. It doesn't like negate the play. Like if they play the cloud, they're still going to get the break out of it. But I'd rather have the text than not have it. So I think the card it's a reasonably strong card in those mono ice aggro shells. I really don't expect to see it in like a true dedicated 13 deck. Charlotte. This is a really interesting one. Oh, let me try to get that a little bit centered. Shout out to the card browser, kind of putting cards in slightly different spots. So Charlotte is a 5-cost knight from FFBE. You can only pay with ICP to cast her. And if she's chosen by summons or abilities, they don't discard a card, the effect is cancelled. And when a character enters your opponent field, it is dull and frozen. So there are 2 things about Charlotte that immediately come to mind. First of all, I don't really think this is a Knight's card. I think the other Charlotte is too important to the deck to give up. And they can't really cast this outside of reviving it with Ramza. So even though I think it's really powerful, I don't expect it to see play in that deck, which means that it's going to be relegated to mostly mono ice or ice X decks that are like able to splash her. And I don't think this goes in mono ice aggro. I think that it slows down your own tempo quite a bit to play this. And I don't think that you're going to be killing your opponent fast enough if you play this card. But I do think that ability is completely bonkers. When a character enters your opponent field, double it and freeze it. So, notably, if you freeze those cards, say you play this Charlotte on, you go turn 1, you play Azalea, you start Charlotte. Your opponent plays a backup, and then it goes back to you. You ditch 2, play Charlotte. Charlotte can't be answered very easily. If your opponent goes for like a Clive Ifrit, they're paying 8 to kill your 5 CP play, which is really strong. You're trading up. You're also dull freezing the Ifrit, so the Ifrit can't attack that turn, and you have the ability to either keep it frozen the entire game or kill it with any of your break a dull forwards abilities. Or if your opponent plays a backup, that backup doesn't do anything for them for 2 full turns, which is huge. Like, just think how long that is. It's so difficult to get value from backups already against ice sometimes. But being unable to set up and get value from your setup seems just so obnoxious. So I think this card is good. It's going to be a weird thing for timing her. I think she's going to have a little bit of the Sid Randell problem where you want her to come down early, but playing her early is going to staunch your own setup quite a bit. She does have a little bit of the uh, Fel Thanos and Neo X Death problem against like fire in specific, where they can like Zac LB target her, then her revenge trigger goes on the stack for her protection, and then you just amount the revenge trigger and she dies. But like even in that situation, they went down as much on the like to do that as you played for the or paid for your Charlotte. So I don't even think that that's a huge problem. It's a huge issue for like Cat 13. Like they play their Lightning and it's dull frozen for 2 turns. So I think this card is really good. I'm going to be experimenting with it a lot, but I'm not sure where she actually ends up and when the best timing to play her is going to be. Summoner. 3 cost backup. When Summoner enters the field, choose an ice summon you break so adds to your hand. Tap, sack. Next summon is reduced by 2. I think this card's pretty good. There's a lot of good ice summons in the game. And usually in my ice decks, I'm on like 10 to 12 summons. This allows me to get those back. I think the ability to break it and cash it out for 2 on your summons is good. There's no timing restriction on it. The only restriction is can't become 0, but you know, a lot of times you'll be casting like a Zalair the Death Seraph, or you can cast like the Kajata from this set. I also just like having breakable backups in general, so I'll definitely be experimenting with this card quite a bit. I think it's a very solid one. Jill. This is a really, really strong card in my opinion. So Jill is a 3-cost job dominant with 7,000 power. She has priming into Shiva for ice and 2. When she enters the field, choose the same number of characters as the icons in your break zone and remove from the game. Dull them. So kind of a mini theme in this set is like number of icons in break zone and remove from game. I wish she also checked for dominance. It's a little bit of a weird thing that like because she doesn't check for like Clive's or Joshua's or any other dominance, it's very hard for this to get to like absurd numbers, but it feeds really well into both the new Shiva and the old Shiva, so I'm not complaining. Old Shiva would have issues where you would play Jill sometimes, and Jill could only dull freeze 1 forward, and you couldn't get 2 targets for her. This Jill won't have that issue very often. Beginning the attack phase during each of your turns, you can pay an ice when you do, choose a dull forward and break it. I think this is just kind of like an upgraded Ishtola for like mono ice control or mono ice mid range. It's very easy if you get to a large number of backups. You can play this, dull the field, kill 1 with the auto at start of combat, and the second main phase you can prime into either of the Shivas to kind of put yourself way ahead. And all this comes off of 1 card. You could either kill 3 forwards or freeze basically dull freeze your opponent's entire field. I expect to play a lot of this card. I'm very happy I have 2 of her in foil. I kind of need to get a 3rd in foil, maybe a full art. But a really cool, really strong card. Snow. So Snow, Cat 4, Job Sentinel with C. When Snow enters the field, choose 1 of the following 2. If it enters the field due to the ability of a Cat 13 character, choose 2 of 2. Either draw a card or your opponent discards a card. It's just a pretty decent card. One thing that I think might end up being an issue with Lightning is kind of knowing what the proactive play is. Like, if your opponent doesn't have a field, like playing Sarah or, you know, a lot of other cards is going to be kind of not doing as much. Snow is a pretty solid interactive thing to be doing. This I draw, you discard has been costed way higher than what Lightning is going to cost you to do this in the past. And having Snow, even if you're in Fire Lightning, you could play this, and that gives you access to Snow LB, which gets you access to your Lightning, which gives you access to your entire game plan, or the Sarah. So I think you'll play this in 13, even in the Fire Lightning builds. And I think it's just a really solid card. Definitely also probably the best that Snow has ever looked. Like this is some good art from Matsuda. Knight, again, please stop printing these. Hobby Japan, I'm tired of them. But if you are going to print them, this is the best of them. So Halone. Halone is the big boss of the 12. 5 CP, 9K. When Helena enters the field, choose 2 characters. If you control 6 or more, job 12, dull freeze them. Your opponent discards a card. So quick rules question, that is one ability. You must have the 6 or more characters to get both the dull freeze and the discard. So I'm of 2 minds. And this is the same thing that I said about Soiree. Or about them like earlier, is that like compared to Soiree, the ceiling is so much higher. And the thing that's holding Soiree back right now is that the ceiling on Soiree is so low that everything in the game is eclipsed it at this point. And Halone is a payoff that Soiree would have killed for. Enter and attack, 2 characters dull freeze, and discard a card. Like, that is 4 CP worth of value on entry. God forbid you give this thing haste and have it attack in the same turn. However, 6 or more is a lot. You have to get to probably 5 backups or 4 backups and 1 other forward. Like, in a deck that's already going to be struggling, it's a true 6-color deck, which is annoying. This is going to be hard to revive off of the fire one, but generally with the fire one, I've almost always revived a backup with it. And this card does not have text until you have 6 or more. Like, 6 is a lot. Like, you are at the late game when you get to that point. So, in testing, the 12 has looked pretty solid. Like, I think the deck has legs and is competitively viable. And I think a large portion of that is just how pushed Halone is when Halone has text. But it's going to be a card that doesn't have text sometimes, and when it doesn't, it's going to feel really bad. Phasalis. This is maybe my second favorite card in the entire set. So this is a 5-cost Warp 1 Job Knight. You can ignore that text. It's not actually a knight. With 8,000 power. From category Brave Exvius. So when a warp counter is removed from Phasalis, you can play a forward of 5 or less with warp from your hand onto the field. This will only trigger if Phasalis is removed from the game. So I think this card is one of the coolest cards in the game. The way that it circumvents the mechanic. It plays with the mechanic, but also circumvents it. It's a very fast warp. I love the idea that, like, this is a card that if you could, you would try to add more warp counters to her so that you could do this more over and over and over again. There are no cards that do that, to my knowledge. I think the only card that could add generic counters only adds them to forwards on field. The card itself is completely terrible. Like, you would never try to do that. But there actually are some really powerful things to be doing with Phasalis. In Element, you have stuff like the Emperor, which is a 0-cost warp, generic 2-cost warp for 2. When it's played by an ability, you get to either remove your opponent's break zone from the game or get back a character from your own break zone. You have cards like the Earth Aerith, that when she enters the field due to an ability, you get back a character from her break zone. Notably, you don't get the warp abilities on cards. So a card like Laguna or Kyros, you're not going to get the warp triggers off of them. But I actually even like Phasalis as just a generic good stuff card. My favorite thing with this card is actually Charlotta, which is when she enters play, you search your deck for any card. So Phasalis becomes pay 2 ice, play Charlotta for free from your hand, search any card, and you basically paid nothing, because you paid 2 for the Phasalis. You played 2 0-cost forwards, and one of them searched your deck for any card in your entire deck to play. I think it's really, really strong. Even just as like an engine in mono ice. I don't know how to go on Warp. We'll talk about Warp more later. I think that Warp is maybe the most interesting deck in the game. At this point, or like, it's not one of the most interesting. It's a really interesting story and an interesting thing to talk about. We'll get there when we talk about Wind and Fina, but Phasalis is a huge reason why I'm really excited for Warp, and also this card is just super cute. Star Sybil, I believe this is one of the last ice cards. 4-cost backup, Job Star Sybil, Cat 11. Really simple text. When a forward you control is chosen by opponent's ability, opponent discards a card. Only triggers once per turn. So shoutouts to the YYT. This was their spoiler. I don't really know how to feel on this card. So on the one hand, a 4-cost backup with no text on entry is not a good card. The number of cards that I would be willing to play that do this are few and far between. Even a card like Tilica that reads like, you win the game by playing it, costs 3. And there are games where like it felt really bad to try to play Tilica. However, I think this is a really strong line of text. I wish it was character. I wish like she protected characters or like summon or ability. So like, the fact it's only ability means that there are going to be matchups where it just isn't going to do very much. But this could proc, 2, 3, 4 times over the course of a game. Procs on both players' turns if they're forced to do things. And there are situations where, like Realm, for instance, Realm is required to choose a forward at the end of your opponent's turn every single turn, if one exists. So if you have Star Sibyl and a forward and your opponent has a Realm, Star Sibyl says your opponent discards a card every single turn, and there's nothing they can do about it. It turns Star Sibyl into Scale Toad, which it is very strong, right? Like, that is a good thing to be doing. I don't know how much I'm going to be playing this card. I feel like it's a card that just won't be seeing any play, and I'm talking about it more than probably anybody else will, other than most people will just say it sucks. I don't think this card is that far off. Notably, there is also the Semilafina in Wind reduces the cost of All-Star Sibyls. So this could be a 2-cost backup in Icewind that then protects your field. That's neat. I don't know what Icewind deck exists that wants that interaction, that protection ability. Because generally Icewind is so pushed into Storm, which is kind of one of the biggest issues that I have with Wind right now, is that Wind's generic support just does not feel very good. And I don't really want to build a deck around Wind cards unless I'm playing like Mono Wind or like a really heavy like Icewind Storm deck. And I don't think that like Semilafina Star Sibyl is fixing that or making that feel better. But it is like, it's not bad. Like, I don't think it's a bad thing. So I might keep an eye on this. I might run it at 1 in like some mono ice control decks for like control mirrors. It seems like it could be really fun into like Refia decks. Like every time they do something, they have to discard a card. I used to be really scared of Tidus with this card because it is such a big tempo loss to get into play. And Fina. So this is the Ice Job 12 backup. When she enters the field, you may pay X. Search for 1 Job 12 that costs extra less play to the field. You can only pay with Job the 12 backups or discarding Job the 12 cards. And she has the ability with 1 and tap to choose a forward and freeze it. This is one of the most important backups in the entire deck. It kind of helps you get online. You need to get to a critical mass of 12 cards for the other ones to have text. There are a couple that are good to get down early. Menfina is one of about 4 of them that do things without having other friends in play, which makes it really important. Notably, this action ability is actually kind of absurd. 1 and tap to choose a forward and freeze it. You can kind of just lock a forward down for the entirety of the game. We'll get to, when we talk about Naimea, we'll see like there are a lot of abilities like this on these cards, and I think that kind of gives them some legs in some long-term game. They don't have to just be like an Unga Boonga, I get my 12 stuff down and then you die. Like, I think that like Menfina could give you like some real longevity to what you're doing because of this ability. It's a really neat, really strong card, and very important to the 12 as a deck. And that is it for the Ice. Again, I think that Ice got a lot of huge buffs this set, and I think it's looking really, really good. Let me know in the comments if there's anything that you are interested or disagree with, or something you're excited for that maybe I didn't talk about enough. And I'll see y'all in the Wind set review.